My father excluded me from the trip, saying that bastards have no place in a family. For 15 years I lived as an outsider, grateful for scraps. But when they left for Europe, I found hidden documents. And realized I was the victim of the greatest betrayal of my life. But when they came back from the trip, I had a surprise ready. From the outside, the Miller residence looked like any other well-kept suburban home in the peaceful neighborhoods outside Seattle, Washington. The lawn was trimmed, the flower beds were neat, and the American flag fluttered softly near the porch. It was the kind of house that appeared in brochures selling dreams of family unity and quiet happiness. But for Ethan Miller, 22 years old and the eldest of 3 boys, it was a prison disguised as perfection. Ethan had lived in that house his whole life, yet he never quite belonged. His room was the smallest, tucked in the attic space above the garage. It was the only one without central heating, making winters unbearable and summers suffocating. There were nights he slept fully clothed under 2 blankets, and mornings he pretended to be late just to avoid family breakfast. Not that he was ever missed. Robert Miller, Ethan's father in name only, was a stern, emotionally absent man who managed a real estate agency downtown. He never shouted, never hit. But his silence was heavy, and his disapproval always sharp as a blade. He referred to Ethan with terms that hovered between disdain and obligation: that boy, Susan's mistake, a summer error. Never, son. Susan, Ethan's mother, was more complicated. She carried kindness in her eyes, but also a constant fear, like someone always one breath away from collapse. She tried, little gestures, half smiles, folded laundry left at his door, but she never defended him. Not once. Not when Robert coldly dismissed him, not when he was left out of family photos, not even when his younger brothers received praise for grades he had surpassed. Dylan and Max, his half-brothers, were 14 and 17. They had their father's brown eyes, easy confidence, and the silent privilege of acceptance. Ethan, on the other hand, had blue eyes like his mother, an angular face, and the quiet watchfulness of someone who had learned early not to expect too much. Still, he tried. Every day. He helped around the house, tutored his brothers, fixed broken electronics, and worked part-time at a tech shop downtown. He asked for nothing and was grateful for scraps. Photography and computers were his escape. His attic room was filled with camera parts, circuit boards, and old laptops he repaired for fun. Through the lens of his Canon DSLR, he captured Seattle's gray skies, street corners, forgotten alleys, and sometimes, his family, always from a distance, always when they weren't looking. He had an eye for shadows and silence. Life moved on in that quiet, suffocating rhythm until one Wednesday evening in late spring. The family was gathered around the dinner table, a rare event. The table was set with Susan's pot roast, mashed potatoes, and steamed broccoli. Ethan, as usual, sat at the far end, a step out of the frame of conversation. He listened, nodded when addressed, and chewed quietly. Then, without warning, Susan clasped her hands together with barely concealed excitement and said, "So. I have news." Max leaned forward. Dylan rolled his eyes but smirked. Robert didn't look up from his plate. "We're going to Europe," she said, her voice soft but eager. 3 weeks. London, Paris, Rome. I finally got the bookings confirmed today. Ethan blinked, confused. For a second, a single, flickering second, he thought maybe, just maybe, he was included. His lips parted with a hopeful breath. "Really?" he asked, trying not to sound too eager. Robert looked up slowly, fork still in hand. His eyes locked on Ethan's. Cold. Final. "You're not going," he said, the words flat and brutal. "Bastards don't go on family vacations." The room froze. Max stopped chewing. Dylan looked down at his plate. Susan didn't say a word. Ethan felt the heat rise in his ears, then drain entirely. His hands gripped the sides of his chair. No one moved. No one looked at him. It was as if he had vanished from the room. Robert returned to his food. Plane tickets are expensive. This trip is for family. You should understand that. Ethan stood up slowly, his chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. Of course, he said, his voice calm but tight. I understand. He walked upstairs. No one followed. That night, from the vent in his ceiling, he listened to the laughter from the living room below. The sound of travel bags being packed, of printed itineraries and excitement. He stared at his cracked ceiling, each second stretching like an hour. He didn't cry. That part of him had gone numb years ago. But deep down, something shifted. It wasn't the cruelty that hurt. It was the ease. How quickly they excluded him, how smoothly they moved on without him. And it was only the beginning. The silence in Ethan's room lasted until well past midnight. Not because he was brooding, but because he had grown used to this kind of void. But this time, it clung to him differently. The phrase echoed again and again, bastards don't go on family vacations. It wasn't the first insult, but it was the first delivered with a certain theatricality, like a public declaration that was meant to settle the question once and for all. There would be no quiet correction in private. No apology through a closed door. It was done. Final. Accepted by all. The next morning came with the scent of coffee and fried bacon drifting up from the kitchen. Ethan heard the faint clatter of dishes, laughter. He didn't go down. He didn't need to. They had made it clear, he was not part of the unit. Instead, he stayed in bed, staring at the shadows moving across his ceiling, trying to suppress the ache in his chest. By noon, the house was alive with preparations. Suitcases rolled across floors. Susan shouted to Max about voltage converters. Dylan was on the phone with a friend, bragging about the Eiffel Tower. Robert's voice carried through the hallways with logistical instructions about passports, hotel bookings, and transportation. Ethan could hear everything from his attic room. Every detail was a reminder that life was about to improve for everyone else, without him. He stepped out eventually, needing water, and nearly collided with Susan at the bottom of the stairs. She flinched when she saw him, her hands full of folded clothes. "Oh. Ethan," she said, startled. "I was just putting these in the bags." He nodded once. "I figured." There was an awkward pause. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, anything, but then closed it again. Her eyes darted toward the living room where Robert was sitting, and her lips tightened. Whatever flicker of guilt she carried, it wasn't enough to spark courage. "You should eat something," she said instead, before brushing past him, disappearing into the guest room. Ethan poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. He didn't care that he was being watched. Max entered the kitchen with sunglasses on his head, tossed his phone onto the counter, and opened the fridge. "You good?" he asked, not quite meeting Ethan's eyes. "Peachy," Ethan replied. Max shrugged. "All right, man. Just asking." Later that day, Ethan walked past the open dining room table. Laid out on the polished wood were 4 navy blue passports. He paused, stared. His fingers twitched. All 4 had gold lettering that caught the afternoon light. They were placed on top of boarding passes and a thick stack of printed itineraries. One for each of them. None for him. He looked up and noticed Dylan watching him from the hallway. "Just so you know," Dylan said, voice low, "I didn't vote on this or anything." Ethan smirked faintly. "Don't worry. I wouldn't have one anyway." Dylan hesitated, then nodded slowly and walked away. The night before their departure, Ethan sat outside on the back porch, the cool Washington air brushing against his skin. He had his camera in hand and was taking photos of the overcast sky. From inside the house, the muffled sounds of a movie, laughter, and footsteps carried through the walls. The sky was unusually clear that evening, the clouds beginning to break apart into soft purple hues. He focused his lens on a dying maple leaf caught in a spider's web and pressed the shutter. The camera clicked. He checked the preview, then deleted it. The shot was perfect, but the memory wasn't one he wanted to keep. Later, as he walked past the guest room, he caught the tail end of a conversation, Robert's voice, sharp and unwavering. "I don't care how awkward it looks. I said he's not coming. That's the end of it." Susan said something in return, but her voice was muffled. Defeated. Ethan went back upstairs without a word. The morning of the trip, Ethan woke to the sound of wheels bumping down the hallway. Suitcases. The final step in the ritual. He stayed in bed until he heard the front door close. Through the attic window, he saw them piling into the car, Robert locking the house, Susan adjusting the straps on her bag, Dylan stuffing his headphones into his ears, and Max already filming something with his phone. None of them looked back at the house. The car pulled away, turning the corner at the end of the street. For the first time in years, the house was completely silent. No footsteps. No chatter. Just the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustling of wind through the trees. Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the empty hallway. Something about the stillness was unfamiliar. Not sad, liberating. He descended slowly, letting his fingers brush the railing. The house didn't feel like his, but it no longer belonged to them either. Not while they were gone. It was neutral territory now. He moved from room to room with the precision of someone walking through a museum. He peeked inside his brother's rooms, noting the careless clutter, open drawers, tangled chargers, cologne bottles tipped over. He walked into his parents' bedroom, a place he had only entered a handful of times. It smelled like Robert's cologne, sharp, synthetic, unmistakably cold. The bed was perfectly made, and Susan's jewelry box sat open on the dresser. He didn't touch anything. Not yet. In the kitchen, he made himself coffee using the espresso machine he had never been allowed to use. He took a sip and smiled. Too bitter. Just right. Then he saw it, a manila folder left near the edge of the kitchen counter. Inside were extra copies of the travel documents, boarding passes, contact info for the tour agency, and a checklist of reservations. He flipped through the pages slowly, noting how everything was planned to perfection. He paused on the hotel listings, eyeing the names and stars. It was a luxury tour. Thousands of dollars spent. And not a single dollar spared for him. His eyes landed on the small note Susan had handwritten on the final page: "Ethan has food in the freezer. Leave keys with the neighbor in case he needs help." His name, an afterthought. A footnote in their grand adventure. He folded the folder and placed it back exactly as he found it. Then, with deliberate calm, he walked to the basement door, opened it, and descended into the dimly lit space he had visited only a handful of times before. Dust danced in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the high basement window. The air was dry and smelled of old wood, rust, and forgotten years. He turned on the light bulb dangling from the ceiling and scanned the shelves. Boxes. Dozens of them. Some labeled, some not. He found the ones marked "Family Records" and "Old Photos" and began sorting. For hours, he sat cross-legged on the floor, opening one box after another. At first, it was just junk: tax documents, utility bills, expired insurance forms. Then came the photo albums, smiling faces, Christmases, birthdays. In most of them, he was either absent or barely visible at the edge of the frame. Cropped. Forgotten. But it wasn't until he opened a small metal box near the bottom of one stack that his pulse began to change. Inside were envelopes, folded papers, and certificates. Among them, his birth certificate. And the name Robert Miller printed clearly under father. He stared at it for a long time. Then, something inside him cracked, not a scream, not a sob, but a shift. A change. One he would not come back from. Ethan didn't remember going back up the stairs. He only knew that at some point he was back in the kitchen, his hands trembling slightly, the birth certificate still in his grip. His breath was shallow, not from panic, but from the cold clarity that had begun settling in his chest. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was realization, solid and irreversible. For years, he had accepted the lie without resistance. They had told him he was the mistake of a summer. That he was not truly Robert's son. That his place in the house was conditional, tolerated, but never claimed. And yet, there it was, in government ink, Robert Miller listed as father. No footnote, no asterisk. He set the document on the kitchen table, then stared at the basement door once more. Something told him there was more down there. One truth never stood alone. He went back down with a flashlight this time. The single bulb overhead cast a limited circle of light, leaving corners in shadow. He crouched near the old filing cabinets and began pulling open drawers. Most of them were rusted, but he managed to pry one loose. Inside were dusty folders with business receipts, legal documents, and financial reports, none of which interested him at first glance. Then he noticed a key taped to the underside of the top drawer. It was small, old-fashioned, and cold to the touch. Not like a house key, more like one meant for a lockbox or a drawer. He looked around and spotted a narrow wooden cabinet tucked behind a stack of broken picture frames and gardening tools. He moved the frames aside and tried the key. It slid in easily, and the lock clicked. Inside were more documents, neatly stacked, preserved in plastic sleeves. They didn't look like random papers, these were curated. Chosen. Hidden. He sat on the floor again and began reading. The first file was a bundle of letters. Old, handwritten ones. Some were from Susan to a woman named Margaret, signed with her full name, Susan Carter Miller. Ethan recognized the name Carter, his mother's maiden name. The handwriting was delicate, flowing, filled with concern and confessions. In one letter, dated shortly after Ethan's birth, Susan wrote, "Robert says we must handle this discreetly. He's agreed to raise the boy as long as the press never finds out. He's worried about his reputation with the firm. I think he hates the baby already. I'm trying, Margaret. But it's like living with a stranger." Ethan's hands clenched around the paper. He moved on to another letter, this one from Robert to someone named Alan. "I'll admit, I panicked. I told Susan I'd claim him. But now that we have Dylan, I need that boy to know his place. If he steps out of line, the whole arrangement collapses. Keep those photos locked. I paid good money for silence, I expect it to hold." Photos? Ethan's heart thudded as he rifled through the folder. Tucked behind the letters was a sealed envelope labeled private. Inside were several Polaroids, grainy, time-stamped, clearly taken in secret. One showed Susan holding a newborn in a hospital bed, smiling weakly. Another showed Robert beside her, holding the same baby, Ethan, with a look that, disturbingly, bordered on genuine pride. On the back of the photo, in Robert's handwriting, "My champion. Born stronger than expected." The contradiction made Ethan's stomach turn. He placed the photos aside and continued digging. There were financial records, payments made to someone named Howard Cartwright. The transactions occurred monthly, consistent for over 4 years. Some were labeled as consulting, others as confidential services. Ethan didn't know who Cartwright was, but the volume of money sent to him raised questions. Each payment was substantial. Thousands of dollars. Then he found the oldest item in the box, a small, laminated card with a name he didn't recognize, Angela Monroe. On the back was a note written in Susan's careful hand, "She knows. Be cautious." Ethan leaned back, processing it all. There was more here than one man's cruelty. This was calculated. A network of control, image maintenance, and secrets layered over secrets. The phrase Robert had used, "bastards don't go on family vacations," wasn't just about exclusion. It was about erasure. He stood up, his legs stiff, and carried the documents to his room. He laid them across his bed, organizing them by type, letters, photos, financials. His camera was still on his desk, and for the first time, he pointed it not at the world outside, but at his own truth. He began photographing the documents, one by one. Each click was methodical, careful. He was building an archive. As the sky darkened outside, Ethan worked in silence, the only sound the occasional rustle of paper or the soft beep of his camera. He didn't feel overwhelmed. If anything, he felt more grounded than he had in years. By midnight, he had created 3 digital folders on his laptop, each labeled with a single word: father, mother, lies. He saved the files on 2 separate hard drives and uploaded backups to a secure cloud server under an alias he had used once for a photography forum. If anything happened to the house, the evidence would live on. Around 2 in the morning, he paused to stretch, his back sore from sitting. He opened his window to let the night air in. The streets were empty. The stars above, barely visible through the Seattle haze, blinked faintly. There was still one place he hadn't searched. The closet in his mother's room. It had been locked earlier, but Ethan now had a key ring he had taken from the kitchen drawer. He walked quietly down the hall, not out of fear, but out of habit. The lock was old and stiff, but with some effort, it clicked open. Inside were old clothes, purses, and shoe boxes. He reached for the highest shelf and pulled down a heavy, velvet-lined box. Inside were more letters, personal ones, unsent. And journals. He opened one, dated the year he turned 10. He asked me today why he gets different gifts at Christmas. I told him it was because he was older and should appreciate different things. He didn't believe me. I think he knows something's off. But what can I say? That his father resents his existence. That I traded love for security. Ethan closed the journal. His mother had known. She had protected the lie as much as Robert had enforced it. And suddenly, the ache returned. Not for himself, but for the version of himself that had once hoped. The boy who waited for his father to smile at him. Who tried to earn love by being quiet, helpful, invisible. He wasn't that boy anymore. And for the first time, he didn't want to be. Morning arrived in a quiet, pale wash of light through the attic window. Ethan hadn't slept. The documents were now catalogued, backed up, and divided into physical folders labeled with sticky notes. He had spent the last hours alternating between silent rage and icy calm. The lies had names now. Faces. Dates. Timelines. What had once been a shapeless feeling of abandonment had transformed into a map of deliberate deception. By 9 o'clock in the morning, he returned to the closet in his mother's room and brought out the remaining journals. They were dated yearly, each volume bound in worn leather and marked with initials. The older ones were less detailed, more surface level, written in a tone that masked emotion under the guise of normalcy. But the later ones carried the weight of silent breakdown. He opened a volume from the year he turned 13. Ethan asked why he couldn't join the summer trip. I told him it was a budget issue. Robert laughed at the excuse later. He said, "Let the boy think it's money. Better than letting him think it's blood." Sometimes I want to tell Ethan everything, but what would that help? He would only hate me too. I couldn't bear that. The same journal had a second entry, dated only weeks later. Robert has started locking the basement again. He's afraid Ethan will find the old files. I told him he was being paranoid. But I wonder, maybe he's right to worry. That night, Ethan sat at the dining room table, the same one where the announcement of the trip had been made, and spread out 3 of the most damning documents. One was the letter Robert had written to Alan, admitting to the original agreement. Another was a signed affidavit tucked between financial documents, likely never intended to be seen, where Robert acknowledged legal paternity of Ethan in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement from Susan. And the last was the photo, the one that once showed pride in Robert's eyes. He didn't cry. Not out of pride, but because his emotions had calcified into something more durable. He wasn't mourning a family anymore. He was preparing a case. It was late afternoon when he powered on his old desktop and began drafting a document. Not a journal entry. Not a letter. But a timeline. He titled it, Constructed Silence, The Life of a Ghost Son. He began with his birth certificate, then added each letter, photo, financial entry, and journal excerpt. Every year had a corresponding event, a moment where the manipulation sharpened, and the lie deepened. He cross-referenced dates with family trips, school events he had missed, and medical records that he retrieved from the filing cabinet. Everything lined up with mechanical precision. The erasure of Ethan Miller had been not just intentional, but strategic. At one point, he stumbled across a file containing information on the legal transfer of a property. It was a deed, signed and filed, that indicated Robert had placed part of his business assets into a trust. The date of transfer was 2 weeks after Dylan's birth. Ethan's name was not included in any of the attached documents. What startled him more, however, was the name listed as a silent witness, Marcus Hayes. The name meant nothing to him at first. But the more he stared at it, the more it gnawed at him. The address attached to the witness signature was local. Still within the city limits. A quick search confirmed the man had once worked for Robert's real estate firm, but his name hadn't appeared on any current rosters or public listings after a certain year, nearly a decade ago. Ethan stared at the monitor. If Marcus Hayes had been a witness to legal filings and had vanished from the public eye, there had to be a reason. And if he had stayed local, perhaps he had something to say. He copied the address and saved it into a separate document labeled Follow-up, Contacts. By the time the sun dipped below the hills, Ethan had printed 32 pages of evidence, arranged in chronological order. He placed them into a binder and labeled it discreetly, Records, ECM. He left it on his desk. In the evening, he received a message from his part-time boss at the tech shop, asking if he could cover a shift the next day. Ethan agreed. He needed the distraction. He needed to remind himself that the world outside this house still existed. That night, he cooked dinner for himself, something he rarely did, pasta, vegetables, and a simple sauce. The sound of the pan, the rhythm of chopping onions, the warmth of something made with care, it grounded him. He sat at the table and ate slowly, deliberately. Not rushed. Not ignored. It wasn't much, but it was his. After cleaning up, he returned to the attic room and opened his personal journal for the first time in months. He wrote only one sentence. I was never a bastard. I was a silenced heir. Then he shut the journal and climbed into bed, not to sleep, but to plan. The lie had been exposed, but the betrayal ran deeper than he could yet fully grasp. And he wasn't done digging. The next morning brought with it a strange sense of clarity. Ethan woke before sunrise, the sky outside still clinging to its deep blue hue. The air in the house was quiet, but no longer oppressive. With the family gone and the silence now filled with purpose, every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet felt like a step forward, not a reminder of his isolation. He went downstairs and made coffee, the bitterness familiar and grounding. The binder with his findings remained on his desk, untouched since the night before. It no longer needed constant attention. It was ready, waiting. Instead, Ethan turned his focus to the items he hadn't yet explored, particularly the boxes of photos and albums that had been too emotionally volatile to open during the first sweep. He returned to the basement, where the air still smelled of old wood and rust, and began methodically pulling out the albums one by one. Some were labeled by year, others by event, Dylan's first birthday, Christmas 2007, Summer at the Lake. Most contained the same theme, smiles, celebrations, laughter, and his absence. He flipped through them with a measured detachment, scanning each page for inconsistencies, for moments where his exclusion wasn't just emotional but physical. Cropped edges, gaps in group photos, even missing labels where his name should have been. Then, at the bottom of one bin, wrapped in a faded scarf, he found a small, black leather photo wallet, something separate from the glossy, curated albums. It was old, worn at the seams, and smelled faintly of perfume. He opened it carefully. The first few photos were simple snapshots, Susan as a young woman, standing outside what looked like a college dormitory. Another showed her holding a newborn in a hospital bed, with a timestamp indicating it was taken shortly after Ethan's birth. She looked tired, but there was something in her eyes, relief, maybe. Or fear. A third photo showed Robert, younger, with less gray and a more open expression, holding the same baby. That alone would have been striking, but what made Ethan freeze was the small, almost invisible inscription on the back. In Susan's handwriting, Seattle General, 4th floor. Art said he's proud. I don't believe him. He stared at it for a long moment. This was more than evidence, it was a moment of truth, one that Susan had chosen to keep hidden from everyone else, preserved in this forgotten photo wallet. The next photo shook him further. It was him, Ethan, maybe 4 or 5 years old, sitting on Robert's shoulders, both laughing. It was the only picture he had ever seen where Robert wasn't looking at him with distance or annoyance. They were in a park, and from the colors of the leaves, it was autumn. Ethan flipped the photo and read the words written faintly in pen, "My champion. Don't forget." The phrase hit like a punch. It was identical to the one Robert had written on the photo from the sealed envelope in the cabinet. My champion. 2 photos. 2 different years. The same inscription. Something wasn't adding up. Ethan had spent his life believing Robert had always hated him. That he had never been wanted. But these photographs, private, unedited, not part of the family albums, told a more complex story. Had Robert once felt something real for him? Had it changed with time, with Dylan's birth, with pressure from outside forces? He needed to know more. He gathered the photo wallet, returned to his room, and began scanning the images into his computer. With the photos digitized, he zoomed in on details he might have missed, the hospital logo on Susan's gown, the date on the visitor badge Robert wore, the background signage in the park. Everything corroborated what the handwriting suggested. These weren't fakes. They were real moments, forgotten or buried for a reason. After organizing the images into a new folder, Ethan opened his journal again and jotted down a single note beneath the previous entry. If I was once his champion, when did I become his threat? Later that afternoon, unable to shake the question from his mind, he ventured into the garage where old filing boxes were stacked among tools and camping gear. One box stood out, it was taped shut more recently, the tape still firm, unlike the brittle edges of the others. Written in marker on the top, "Personal, do not discard." He cut the tape with a box cutter and opened it. Inside were a series of manila folders, each labeled with initials and dates. Some were clearly related to Robert's real estate business, others seemed unrelated. Then he found a folder marked EM, Archive. His initials. Inside were school reports, artwork from elementary school, notes from parent-teacher conferences. Ethan's throat tightened. These were things he had assumed had been thrown away or forgotten. But they had been kept. Neatly. Preserved. One note in particular stood out, a letter from his second-grade teacher praising Ethan's creativity and kindness. Attached to it was a sticky note in Robert's handwriting, "Don't let him waste this. Enroll him in the summer program." Ethan sat down on the concrete floor, the letter in his hands. So much of his memory told him Robert had always resented him. But here was a record of support, however brief. Something had changed along the way. A shift. A decision to turn affection into distance, perhaps out of fear, or manipulation, or both. This discovery didn't undo the years of coldness, exclusion, or pain. But it introduced a new variable, the possibility that Robert hadn't always been a villain. And if that was true, then someone, or something, had made him abandon that connection. Susan? Pressure from colleagues? A hidden incident? He had no answers yet, only more questions. But he knew this, the narrative he had accepted for most of his life was crumbling. The role of the unwanted child, the silent outcast, it was a role given to him, not earned. He returned to his room and laid the new documents next to the others. The binder was nearly full now, but he began a second one. This one wasn't labeled records. It was labeled contradictions. Because that was what he was uncovering now, not just truths, but the dissonance between them. A man who held him proudly and then shunned him. A mother who protected him with one hand and excluded him with the other. A family built on curated images and selective memory. And hidden within it all, a forgotten photograph, a fragment of love that had once existed. It wouldn't save them. But it would help him destroy the lie they had built in its place. Late one autumn afternoon, with dusk settling like a gray blanket over the streets, Ethan heard the doorbell echo through the silent house. It startled him. No one ever visited during this time, not since his parents had packed for Europe. He paused, staring at the front door from the kitchen, the deep binder labeled contradictions open across the island. He rose slowly and approached, heart steady but alert. At the door was a man in his late 40s, suit slightly rumpled, holding a leather portfolio. His eyes looked familiar, worn but purposeful. "Ethan Miller?" the man asked gently. Ethan nodded, eyes narrowing. "I'm Marcus Hayes. I worked for your father once." The name, the person Ethan had found as a witness on that legal deed, stood before him. He gestured inside. Ethan stepped back and stood aside, confusion mixing with guarded curiosity as the man entered. Marcus removed his coat and paused, looking at the kitchen table strewn with documents. He cleared his throat. "I was notified only recently that you might be here, in town. I wasn't sure, but when I connected the dots, your name, Seattle, and that trust document, it led me here." He paused. "I have something to show you, something I should have shared long ago." Ethan guided him to the dining room, and Marcus cautiously slid a folder from his portfolio. He opened it, revealing scanned printouts, emails, expense reports, memos, time-stamped throughout years that spanned before and after Dylan's birth. "Your father hired me as a fixer, a legal assistant of sorts," he explained. "But when I refused to destroy or hide certain records, I was let go. I never intended to leave Seattle completely. I maintained copies." With each word, Marcus laid out the printed evidence on the table, organizing with a deliberate hand, invoices paid to Howard Cartwright, minutes from trust meetings, and personnel memos addressing sensitive dependents. As Ethan studied the pages, he realized these documents corroborated the payment records and agreements he had uncovered. But there was one memo that bore a deeper sting, a meeting summary dated weeks after his birth. It recorded Susan's request to modify the trust to explicitly exclude Ethan from inheritance. It stated she feared public scandal could ruin Robert's reputation, and hers. Susan had asked that funds reserved for Ethan be redirected to an unassigned account. The trustee hesitated, but Robert insisted. "Signed. Final." Marcus looked up. "I'm sorry it took me so long. I thought I was protecting you by staying away. But after seeing your name in the filings, I knew you deserved to know everything." Ethan remained silent. He felt only the slow burn, the ache of being betrayed not once but twice, by the family he believed loved him, and by the silence of an ally who stayed hidden. Marcus folded his hands. "There's more. At one point, your father discussed having you move away to a boarding school, somewhere far enough to keep you out of local dances, photos, events. He said it was, for your own good, but also mentioned that the fewer people saw you, the less risk." Ethan's breath caught. The world he had considered cruel was far more calculated. Marcus continued, quietly pacing. "I have more records stored at home. I came here first, to see how you're doing. To give you the option." Ethan looked at him, eyes distant. "Option for what?" Full disclosure, Marcus replied. Documents. Originals. I can give them to you, or, if you prefer, I can help ensure they get into the hands of someone who can expose this legally or publicly. But I'm not here to take over. I'm here to offer knowledge. Ethan swallowed. He wondered, trusted, the man who once helped orchestrate his suppression. He looked around at the scattered papers, the binder beside him. He remembered how he felt as a boy, quiet, helpful, eager to belong. Now he felt something else, empowered. He nodded slowly. You said you kept the originals. Marcus pulled a satchel from his portfolio and brought out a USB drive, a small sealed envelope, and a slim notebook taped shut. This is everything. Emails, legal documents, hand-signed letters, and my notes. He placed them in front of Ethan. Ethan slid the USB drive into his laptop and accessed the files. The folder structure mirrored the binder, but deeper, metadata, timestamps, handwritten notes in margins. One folder was labeled Susan Carter, transparent. Another R. Miller, trust. A third Howard Cartwright, good behavior fees. He clicked into one folder documenting a series of multi-thousand-dollar monthly payments labeled Quiet Services. Another established a timeline when Robert began pushing for distancing between Ethan and the family photo albums, the date, 6 months after Dylan was born. Marcus watched him, respectful of the silence. When Ethan finally looked up, tears were glistening in his eyes, but it wasn't sorrow. Even in anger and grief, there was clarity. After midnight, long after Marcus had left, Ethan remained at the table, the entire binder now open alongside Marcus's USB drive, printouts spreading to fill the space. He picked up the slim notebook, Marcus's written recollections, and read a terse entry. It wasn't meant to destroy the boy, but to protect the image. Regret formed too late. Scrawled below, Marcus had written, Ethan's voice deserves to be heard. He closed the notebook and sat back. The house felt different now. Not empty. Not abandoned. Alive, with possibility. He began texting Marcus a question, where can I meet you tomorrow? He pressed send. Then he opened a fresh document on his computer, typing as if he were drawing a first breath, Chapter 1, Truth. And he began to plan. The family would come home soon, and he would be ready. Song lyrics from his childhood drifted through his mind, unbidden, you belong to me. That phrase used to make his throat hurt. But now, after discovering the truth, it felt like a promise he was reclaiming. The following morning arrived with the haze of impending rain hanging over the suburbs. Seattle had always been a city of clouds, but today the gray seemed heavier. Ethan, however, moved with sharp clarity. After weeks submerged in silence and revelations, the fog in his own mind had lifted. He had stopped asking why they did it. Now, he was asking how to undo the narrative they had crafted, and when to make them watch it unravel. He sat at his desk with Marcus Hayes's USB drive still plugged into his laptop. The files were backed up on 2 different clouds under aliases, and one was hidden on an encrypted drive inside an old digital camera he had stripped of parts. He didn't trust visibility. Not yet. But exposure, he had begun crafting that. By noon, Ethan had set up a private server using a hosting service he had purchased anonymously with prepaid gift cards. The domain name he selected was subtle, not something easily searchable or suspicious, silentproof.net. The homepage was empty, blank except for a single black bar at the top. Over the next hours, he would build the structure, layers of navigation labeled not by emotion, but by fact. He created 4 sections. The first, paternity and legal fraud. The second, inheritance manipulation. The third, emotional recordings. And finally, visual archives. Each section would contain files, photos, and excerpts with timestamps and names. But it wasn't just about dumping information. Ethan wanted it structured like a courtroom, but narrated like a story. He was building not a scream of pain, but a guided exposition of betrayal. By 3 o'clock, he had embedded audio clips Marcus had provided, recordings of meetings in which Robert referred to Ethan as a delicate problem, and others where Susan's voice trembled while agreeing to keep the boy's presence discreet for the company's future. He paired these with photos of him at family events, cropped from the edges, faces turned away. The juxtaposition was painful and powerful. He scanned in notes from Susan's journals, redacted personal details, and added them as footnotes beneath scanned photos of the journal pages themselves. In one section, he included financial statements showing the rerouted funds, originally meant for Ethan's college, now directed to an account marked, Housing, DM. He made sure to list every date. Each page loaded slowly as he previewed the layout, which he wanted to control with surgical precision. He wasn't aiming for a public dump. Not yet. He wanted the site private, viewable only by invitation, a secure link sent to specific people at a specific moment. He made a list. At the top, Robert and Susan Miller. Then, Dylan and Max, not because he hated them, but because they were complicit by silence. Beneath them, former employees from Robert's firm, especially those who had attended the trust meetings Marcus mentioned. And finally, a select handful of Ethan's former teachers, neighbors, and even a few classmates, people who had once offered passing glances of sympathy but never asked the right questions. He wanted them to see, not just the cruelty, but the system that maintained it. At 5 o'clock, he received a text from Marcus, "I've secured the Cartwright documents. He's currently in Florida. But his signature is on everything. We have 6 letters he sent requesting monthly disbursements under fake consulting titles." Ethan replied simply, "Scan and encrypt. I'll add them to the site tonight." He turned his attention to the videos. Most of the old home footage had been digitized over the years. Ethan still had copies stored on an external hard drive from when he had tried to teach himself editing in high school. He sifted through birthdays, Christmas mornings, backyard barbecues. He searched not for moments of happiness, but for patterns, his own invisibility, or when the camera would suddenly shift away from him when he entered a frame. In one particularly revealing clip, Susan is filming Dylan's 6th birthday. The entire family is singing. Ethan, about 10 years old, steps into the frame holding a second cake, one he decorated. Robert's voice is clearly audible, "Get him out of the shot." The camera jerks. The video cuts. Ethan extracted that clip, trimmed it down, and titled it, "Uninvited Helper." He placed it at the top of the visual archives section. Another video showed Ethan setting up folding chairs before a barbecue. He's doing it alone, while Max and Dylan play in the background. At one point, Ethan waves to Susan holding the camera. She lowers it. The footage cuts again. Each clip added to the narrative. Not by accusation, but by accumulation. He inserted timestamps, labeled locations, and linked each clip to a journal entry or financial statement. The site was becoming a mosaic of silence, built to let viewers witness the truth as it unfolded without Ethan having to narrate it directly. But the final piece was still missing. Impact. It wasn't enough to confront them. He wanted them to feel the gravity of their actions in real time. He turned off the laptop and walked to his attic closet. Inside a shoebox labeled "junk cords," he found a small motion sensor camera, one he'd used during a freelance project on wildlife. He tested it, cleaned the lens, and positioned it in the living room, angled perfectly toward the front door. When the Millers returned from Europe, he would be there. And the site? It would be waiting. He designed a USB device that, once plugged into the living room television, would trigger a presentation mode, preloaded with select media files, arranged like a documentary. He rehearsed it once that evening, dimming the lights, connecting the USB, and watching the clips unfold on screen, photos, video, audio, journal pages. All choreographed to match. He programmed the television remote to open the file with one button. The Millers wouldn't walk into a confrontation. They would walk into a mirror. At midnight, Ethan wrote a note, printed it in bold letters and left it on the coffee table. It read, "You may have thought I was invisible. But I was always watching. Now, it's your turn." He sat on the couch in silence after that, staring at the black screen, the USB ready, the camera already recording. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't bitter. He was prepared. The plan was no longer an idea. It was alive. Breathing. And time was running out for the truth to remain buried. The next day began like all others had since the family left, quiet, overcast, and heavy with a sense of slow inevitability. Ethan had developed a strange calm in the solitude. He spent the morning refining the structure of the site, adding the documents Marcus sent overnight, copies of letters bearing Howard Cartwright's signature, notarized acknowledgments of payment transfers, and, most damning, a handwritten clause with Robert's initials stating, "EM is to be excluded. Permanently. No exceptions." The site was nearly complete. Ethan reviewed the order in which the content would appear in the living room video presentation. He had even timed the clips and ensured the USB function was seamless. Each component, legal, personal, financial, was now more than evidence. It was part of a story no one could deny. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he decided to clean. Not to impress anyone, but to erase the scent of neglect left in the house, dusty corners, untouched tables, smudged windows. He moved through the rooms methodically, pausing only to test the security cameras he had set up to document the family's return. The devices were working, capturing motion, audio, and syncing to a local drive with a secure backup. He was in the middle of wiping the glass on the back door when something caught his attention, a soft, high-pitched beep from upstairs. He froze. Then moved fast. It was his laptop. The beep repeated, irregular, unfamiliar. He climbed the stairs 2 steps at a time and found the screen awake, displaying a flashing error window, "System breach detected. File integrity compromised." His chest tightened. He clicked to investigate. The interface slowed, hesitated, then froze entirely. When he finally forced a reboot, what loaded wasn't his clean desktop, but a flickering, stripped-down version of it. The folders labeled contradictions and silent-proof backups were gone. He stared at the empty screen, disbelieving. He opened the file recovery software. Nothing. External drives. Both unreadable. Corrupted. He reached for the second hard drive hidden in the gutted camera. Plugged it in. Blank. Not even the boot code registered. Panic came not as a shout, but a cold, hollow pressure behind his eyes. He opened the local backup for the motion sensors. Still there, but the last sync had failed. Nothing after midnight had been recorded. He checked the server he had built for the website. The domain loaded. But the folders were empty. Every file directory, every archive, every embedded element, gone. He typed faster, breathing heavier. He checked the server logs. Unauthorized access. A user ID he didn't recognize. Location data scrambled through a VPN. The access occurred 12 hours ago, when he was asleep, just after he had tested the television sequence. He scanned the house, frantically now, for signs of entry, but there was nothing. No doors forced open. No signs of movement. Then he remembered the cameras. Not the digital ones. The physical memory cards. He darted to the basement, retrieved the security SD cards, and plugged them into his laptop. The footage from the past 48 hours was still intact. He fast-forwarded through it until a subtle movement caught his eye, 2 nights ago. Dylan. Ethan paused the clip, rewound, and watched more carefully. Dylan had come back into the house, alone. While the rest of the family slept in some European hotel, Dylan had returned quietly, used his own key, and gone straight for the basement. He moved with intention, like someone searching for something specific. He opened the box where Ethan had first found the photo wallet. He rifled through the folders, his face tense, his movements fast. He had found something. He pulled out one envelope, Ethan couldn't see which, and then checked the cabinet where Marcus's documents had been. After several minutes, Dylan pulled out his phone. He took photos. Dozens. Then he left. Ethan watched the camera feed track him up the stairs. Dylan paused outside the attic. Looked at the door. Then turned away. Ethan leaned back, pulse hammering. He wasn't hacked by some stranger. It had been his brother. Not out of cruelty, Dylan hadn't deleted anything. He had simply warned someone. Ethan guessed who. His father. Maybe even Cartwright. That early breach had allowed Robert to act, remotely or with help, and scrub the data. And now it was all gone. Almost. Ethan pulled open the drawer where he had left the original binders. Still there. Physical copies. Handwritten notes. Photos. Letters. Journal scans. The USB from Marcus. He hadn't digitized everything. He had intentionally kept some of it offline, analog, precisely because of this fear. It wasn't a complete loss. But it was a setback. A brutal one. His plan was now fractured. The site was empty. The television files deleted. The backups corrupted. He could rebuild, but not in time. His family would return in 2 days. Less than 48 hours to reconstruct months of quiet work. He stood in the middle of the attic, breathing through clenched teeth. Then he moved. Fast. He unplugged the motion sensor camera and repositioned it to cover the entire living room, not just the entryway. Then he pulled out his second laptop, older, clunky, but never connected to the internet. He would use it as an isolated workstation. Over the next hours, Ethan began rebuilding. This time offline. He retyped transcripts. He rescanned photos. He recreated the timeline from memory and cross-referenced it with the paper evidence. He used screenshots from the camera footage of Dylan's intrusion as part of the new narrative. Even in their absence, they tried to erase the truth. He didn't stop to eat. He didn't answer Marcus's text. By midnight, his fingers were cramping. His eyes burned. But a new plan was forming, leaner, sharper. No longer a website. No longer a digital archive vulnerable to interference. He would do it all live. When they walked through the door, they would not find a pre-programmed display. They would find him, binder in hand, evidence on the table, camera rolling, and Ethan ready to tell the story himself. In his voice. In his presence. No way to delete it. And no place left to hide. The night after the data breach passed without sleep. Ethan had managed to rebuild a significant portion of the archive by hand, but the pressure of time bore down on him like a second skin. 2 days had become one. The morning sun filtered weakly through the attic window, casting long, uncertain shadows across the floor. The house felt different now, less like a prison, more like a battleground. Every hallway was familiar but charged with memory, each room an echo chamber of the silences that had shaped him. Mid-morning came with a vibration, his phone. A notification. A message from an unknown number. I didn't want it to happen like this. Check the bottom drawer in the hall cabinet. D. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment, fingers curling slowly. Dylan. The same brother who had broken into the house, copied confidential documents, and, directly or not, caused the collapse of his carefully constructed plan. The message wasn't an apology. But it wasn't silence, either. He stepped into the hallway and knelt before the tall, narrow cabinet beside the coat closet. He hadn't opened that drawer in years. It was mostly used for batteries, cords, and abandoned manuals. The bottom drawer stuck slightly but gave way after a gentle tug. Inside, tucked beneath a bundle of old extension cords, was a manila envelope. No label. just a single line of clear tape along the flap. He opened it carefully. Inside were 5 printed photographs, each one more shocking than the last. The first was of Robert, young, confident, and smiling, standing beside a woman who was not Susan. The background suggested a resort or private retreat. The date stamp in the corner placed it just over a year before Ethan's birth. The second photo was more damning. The same woman, now visibly pregnant, seated at a hospital waiting room. Robert's figure blurred in the background, caught walking away. On the back of the photo was written, June, before he made the deal. The third photo showed Robert shaking hands with Howard Cartwright. Both were younger, formal, the image clearly snapped without their awareness. The fourth was an email printout from Cartwright to Susan, with the subject line, the agreement. The body contained a short but direct instruction, confirm paternity settlement and ensure no inheritance rights are discussed publicly. Final wire to be processed post-signature. But it was the fifth photo that sent a slow chill down Ethan's spine. It was a child, him, unmistakably, with Dylan standing behind him. Both boys were no older than 5 and 8, respectively. They were in the backyard, surrounded by balloons and a single, happy birthday, sign. Ethan was holding a gift, looking toward the house. Dylan was watching Ethan. Not laughing. Not smiling. But observing, as if already aware of a divide that hadn't yet been named aloud. On the back, written in a surprisingly neat hand, was the phrase, he always knew. He just didn't understand why. Ethan sat on the floor for several minutes, envelope in his lap. The photographs were copies, not originals. That meant Dylan had found them long ago, possibly even before Ethan discovered the documents in the basement. Dylan had seen the cracks. He had witnessed the manipulation from a closer perspective. And yet, he had remained silent. Until now. Ethan returned to his room and laid the envelope contents beside his newly reconstructed binder. The inclusion of Cartwright's direct involvement was invaluable, especially the photo and email. It tied the private betrayal to a larger network of legal manipulation. With this, he could prove that not only had his parents deliberately hidden his legitimacy, but they had also paid to bury it under false agreements and redirection of inheritance rights. Still, the timing of Dylan's confession was suspicious. Ethan scrolled back through old texts. Nothing from Dylan in months. Their last conversation had been a brief exchange about who would take the car to the mechanic. Before that, silence. Dylan had always been the quieter of the two brothers, less hostile than Max but equally disengaged. He had never defended Ethan, but neither had he openly mocked him. He existed in the gray, the kind of sibling who didn't kick you while you were down, but never helped you stand either. Now, after copying evidence and likely alerting Robert, he left an envelope with enough information to restart the process. Guilt? Self-preservation? Or something else? Ethan didn't have answers. But the fact remained, he had more now than he did the night before. Enough to finish what he had started. That evening, he received a second message from the same unknown number. I didn't tell him everything. I only sent one image. The photo of the park. I wanted him to know he failed you. Not to stop you. I didn't expect him to go nuclear. D. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. He believed Dylan about the park photo, the one where Robert held him with something that looked like affection. But it didn't matter. Even a single leak had caused the server breach, the deletion of backups, and the near derailment of his plan. Dylan's intentions, whatever they were, had consequences. He typed a reply but deleted it before sending. There was nothing left to say. Instead, he copied the new materials into the final version of the binder. He made handwritten notes beneath each new piece of evidence, highlighting timelines, emotional context, and relational shifts. He included the image of the birthday party, not for its legal value, but for its symbolism. The next morning, less than 24 hours before the family's return, Ethan tested the living room camera one final time. It was armed, aimed directly at the couch where he would sit, binder in hand. No USB presentation. No pre-edited videos. Just him, face to face with the people who had built a world where he was a footnote. He had already rehearsed the moment in his mind, the sound of the door unlocking, the echo of suitcases being dragged across the floor, the first glimpse of him sitting calmly, waiting. There would be no shouting. No accusation. Just the truth. Inescapable. Undeniable. He adjusted the lighting in the room, tested the microphone input, and sat down in the silence. Then he placed the final item on the table, the envelope from Dylan. And waited. The house was quiet in the hours before their arrival. Ethan had cleaned every room meticulously, not for their comfort, but because the mess of the past weeks needed to be erased, swept away to make room for the confrontation. The living room was pristine. The coffee table was bare, save for the thick binder at its center, flanked by a second, thinner folder containing the new documents Dylan had provided. The armchair opposite the couch remained empty. Ethan had positioned himself directly across from it, facing the front door. A single camera sat on a high shelf, discreet but active, recording every angle. Outside, the street remained calm. Neighbors mowed their lawns. A delivery truck passed. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Ethan sat with one leg crossed, hands folded in his lap. His breath was slow and deliberate. He had nothing left to prepare. The evidence was ready. The narrative was unshakable. This would not be a conversation. It would be a reckoning. At 3:46 in the afternoon, the quiet broke. A car pulled into the driveway. Tires crunched over gravel. Doors opened, then closed in rapid succession. Muffled voices echoed faintly as suitcases were dragged out. The key turned in the lock. The door opened. And then came the pause. Susan entered first. She froze in the doorway, her suitcase still in hand. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him seated on the couch. Behind her, Robert stepped in, brushing past her with practiced indifference. His gaze caught on Ethan and lingered there, uncertain. Dylan and Max followed, stepping inside in silence. Max stopped mid-step when he noticed the camera. Dylan's eyes flicked to the binder, then to Ethan, then away again. Ethan didn't move. "Welcome back," he said evenly. Robert set down his briefcase. "What the hell is this?" he asked. Ethan gestured to the binder. "That's your life. Or at least, the parts of it you didn't think I'd ever find." No one moved. Susan stepped forward hesitantly. "Ethan, what are you doing?" "I'm not doing anything," he replied. "I'm showing you what you've done." He leaned forward and opened the binder to the first page. Birth certificate. Robert Miller listed as father. No hesitation in the tone, no embellishment in his movements. He turned the page. Letters between Robert and Cartwright. Then journal excerpts from Susan, documented by date, in her own handwriting. "I found the basement records. The payment ledgers. The trust documents. The email to Cartwright with your signature. I found the photos. The ones you thought were buried. And then Dylan gave me more. Because even he knew what you were doing was a lie too big to carry." Robert's jaw clenched. "Dylan, is that true?" he demanded. Dylan didn't answer. Susan stepped closer, but Ethan held up a hand. "Don't. I'm not doing this for reconciliation. I don't want an apology. I want acknowledgement. I want it recorded that the reason I was excluded, ignored, was not because I was illegitimate, but because you were cowards." Susan blinked, but her tears didn't fall. "You told people I was a mistake. You let them believe I was the result of some affair. But I wasn't. I was yours. Legally. Biologically. But not emotionally. Not publicly. You stripped me of my name without ever changing it. Robert folded his arms. You have no idea what we sacrificed to keep you safe. Ethan laughed, once, humorless. Safe? You mean invisible? You sacrificed nothing. You made a deal to hide me in plain sight and then punished me for existing. He turned to Max. Did you know? Max shifted uncomfortably. Not everything. Ethan nodded. But enough. He turned the page to the photographs, Robert holding him in the hospital. Then the one in the park. Then the final one, him and Dylan at the birthday party. You had moments, he said, quieter now. You had chances. There were times you could have told me the truth. You could have stopped pretending I didn't matter. But you chose to sustain the lie. You chose comfort over courage. Robert's voice darkened. What do you want from us, Ethan? Money? An apology? You're not getting either. I don't want your money, Ethan said. And I wouldn't accept an apology even if you offered it. What I want is exposure. Clarity. I want you to watch this story unfold and realize you are no longer in control of it. He picked up the second folder and handed it to Robert. That's for your lawyer. It includes a full breakdown of the forged trust modifications and a timeline of inheritance misdirection. Marcus Hayes has already made his deposition. Cartwright's payments are traceable. The statute of limitations on fraud hasn't passed. Robert opened the folder, flipped through 3 pages, then slammed it shut. This is blackmail. No, Ethan said. It's truth. Recorded. Documented. And soon, shared. Max stepped forward. You're really going to go public with this? I'm not hiding anymore, Ethan replied. Susan sat down, slowly, as if her knees could no longer carry the weight. We thought it was best, she said weakly. You were born into a world that wasn't ready. Robert's career, the family business, the press, it would have destroyed everything. Ethan turned to her. And so you destroyed me instead. Dylan spoke for the first time. He asked me to search the house before we left. He thought you'd start digging. I didn't tell him about the documents. Just sent him the photo of the park. I thought maybe he'd see what he lost. Robert's voice sharpened. You did what? Dylan didn't flinch. You lied to all of us. Maybe you didn't expect me to care, but I do. Robert turned toward Ethan. So this is it? You're going to destroy the family name over what? A few photos and old letters? No, Ethan said. I'm going to reveal the truth. If the name is destroyed by that, then it was never worth protecting. He stood, gathering the binder. The room was silent but heavy with unspoken words. Robert's eyes narrowed. Susan stared at the floor. Max looked away. Dylan watched Ethan. Ethan crossed the room, reached for the remote, and pointed it at the TV. The screen lit up, not a presentation this time, but a live feed from the camera now capturing all of them. Their faces, their stillness, their silence. He turned back to them. From this point on, every word, every denial, every justification is recorded. For you. For me. For whoever needs to see it. And then he walked out. Ethan didn't return to the house that evening. He walked until the sun had dipped behind the houses and the street lamps began to flicker on, one by one. He passed the familiar streets of his childhood, the houses of old classmates, the playground where he had once sat alone while his brothers played with their friends. The weight in his chest was not relief or even victory, it was a shifting, slow-burning fire. He had delivered the truth. He had looked each of them in the eye and said what he had waited a lifetime to say. But now came the next question, what happens when the truth is no longer a secret? He spent the night at a nearby motel, paying in cash and using the alias he had set up weeks earlier. The next morning, he returned to the house at dawn. Not to speak with them, not to confront them again, but to collect what was his. He moved quietly through the house, finding it as silent as when he had left it. The living room was exactly as he had left it. The camera still blinking, the binder untouched. No one was awake. He didn't care. He went to his room, packed what he needed: hard drives, the camera body, his notes, Marcus Hayes's original folder, and a sealed envelope he had left taped beneath the desk. He had known this day would come. He had been ready to leave the house for good long before he ever confronted them. The confrontation had only been the closure. The departure was the beginning. But as he prepared to leave, he noticed something on the floor near the foot of his bed. An envelope, identical to the one Dylan had hidden in the hallway cabinet. This one was labeled in a handwriting he hadn't seen before. He opened it slowly. Inside was a legal document, a notarized form, dated 15 years ago. The title read, "Voluntary Renunciation of Paternal Rights." It had been signed by Robert Miller. Witnessed by two parties. One of whom was Cartwright. The other was Susan. It was real. He dropped into his desk chair, rereading the document 3 times. It was not just symbolic. It had legal weight. Though Robert had never denied paternity publicly, he had signed away all legal responsibility in a closed legal session, then concealed the document with the help of Cartwright. The paper included clauses stating that Ethan was to be excluded from any inheritance, assets, and legal claims under Robert's estate. But that wasn't the twist. At the bottom of the document was a handwritten note, dated a week later, signed by Susan. Robert insisted this be filed quietly. He says it's for our future. I don't agree, but I signed. I don't want Ethan to suffer, but I'm tired of fighting. I will tell him one day. I hope he forgives me when I do. Ethan set the paper down, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't know what shocked him more, the fact that Susan had quietly contested the decision, or that she had planned to tell him. Planned, and never did. Why had the document been placed in his room? It hadn't been there the day before. He would have seen it. He checked the hallway. Empty. Then, he heard it. A faint movement downstairs. Ethan crept to the landing and looked over the banister. Susan stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of tea. She hadn't noticed him. He descended the stairs. She turned when she heard him, startled but not surprised. I left something in your room, she said softly. I didn't know if I should. But I thought, maybe you'd want to see it. I saw it, Ethan replied. She nodded, then looked away. I didn't know he was going to file it, she said. Not until it was done. He told me we could still raise you together, that it was just a formality. He said it was for protection. His firm was under pressure, and he thought. She stopped. The silence filled in the rest. I wanted to tell you when you were old enough. But by then, things had already changed too much. Ethan looked at her, searching for any trace of the woman he once believed loved him enough to fight. You knew he was erasing me, Ethan said. You watched it happen. I didn't know how to stop it, she whispered. But you didn't try. I did, she insisted, her voice shaking. At first. But I was alone, Ethan. I had no power. No money of my own. He controlled everything. I tried to protect you in other ways, your schooling, your food, your health. I thought if I kept you close, that would be enough. It wasn't, Ethan said. It never was. She looked like she might cry, but Ethan didn't wait. He turned, grabbed his backpack, and headed for the door. Where will you go? She asked. Somewhere you'll never need to lie for me again. He left without another word. Hours later, Ethan stood before a lawyer in downtown Seattle, someone Marcus had recommended. He slid the folder across the desk, opened the binder, and said what he had waited too long to say. I want to file a civil claim. The lawyer listened carefully, flipping through the documents. "This is strong," he said after reviewing the evidence. "Very strong. It's not just inheritance fraud. You've got emotional neglect, financial misdirection, falsified legal documents, suppression of custodial rights. If you're willing to go public, we could also build a narrative case." "I've already started recording," Ethan said. "There's a full archive. Videos. Audio. Statements. And I've got a public-facing version of the site prepared." The lawyer nodded. "Then we'll draft a preliminary motion. File it by the end of the week." Ethan signed the first document that day. When he left the office, the air outside smelled like rain. He pulled his jacket close and began walking, not home, not to the house he had been exiled from, but toward the city's heart. He passed strangers, unseen. But for the first time, it didn't bother him. He was no longer unseen by choice. He had stepped into the light. And the next move was his. The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the first ripples had already begun to reach the surface. Ethan hadn't needed to alert the press himself. The legal claim, once processed and recorded, became public record. And once a local legal affairs blog noticed Robert Miller's name attached to a civil case involving inheritance fraud and parental renunciation, the inquiries began. It wasn't sensational. Not yet. The details were still buried within the case documents, but Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the story caught momentum. And he was ready. His public site, an edited, anonymized version of the evidence, was activated the same day. No names were mentioned in full, but the patterns were unmistakable to those who knew the family. The footage from the living room confrontation was not posted, but a transcript was. The structure of truth didn't need spectacle. It needed clarity. Back at the Miller house, silence ruled. Susan had locked herself in the master bedroom, rarely emerging except to drink tea or move quietly between rooms. Max had returned to his campus apartment, claiming he needed to clear his head. Dylan stayed, but barely spoke to anyone, choosing to remain in the guest room on the far side of the house, headphones in, door closed. Robert, meanwhile, did not react with rage. Not publicly. He spent his days pacing the study, phone pressed to his ear, whispering curt orders to lawyers, accountants, and trusted associates. But behind that strategic fury was the unmistakable shadow of something he wasn't used to, fear. Because Robert Miller, for all his coldness and calculation, had never been challenged by someone who knew how he operated. Ethan had not come with demands or threats. He had come with documentation. With timelines. With legal viability. The family was not collapsing in noise. It was collapsing in quiet. The first direct consequence came in the form of a letter from the Washington State Office of Legal Affairs, informing Robert of an impending audit regarding undisclosed asset transfers. Ethan received a forwarded copy from his attorney. It was not yet a criminal inquiry, but it signaled something deeper, the unraveling of the financial facade. Then came the calls from old colleagues. Former partners of Robert's agency began to distance themselves. One issued a vague press statement declaring they were re-evaluating the ethical direction of the firm. Inside the house, the walls seemed to grow narrower. Susan finally broke her silence on the third night. She approached Dylan's room and knocked once before pushing the door open. He looked up from his desk, earbuds out. "Can I sit?" she asked. He nodded. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking older than he'd ever seen her. Her eyes weren't red, but they carried a dull fatigue, as if every memory had become too heavy to carry. "I never thought it would go this far," she said quietly. "It didn't go this far," Dylan replied. "It started this far. You just ignored it." She looked down at her hands. "Do you think he'll win?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "He already did," Dylan answered. "Not because of the lawsuit. Because he's free of all of this now. And we're the ones stuck in it." Robert heard the conversation from the hallway but didn't enter. Instead, he went back to the study and poured himself a glass of scotch. The trembling in his hand didn't stop until the second glass. He stared at the framed photograph on his desk, one from years ago, the whole family posed in front of the Christmas tree. Ethan was not in the photo. He realized then how long it had been since he'd looked at a picture of Ethan without trying to erase him. The phone rang again. Another lawyer. He didn't answer. Later that night, Susan sat alone in the living room, the house dark except for the glow of a reading lamp. The binder Ethan had left behind still sat on the coffee table, closed but looming. She hadn't touched it since that day, hadn't opened the pages filled with her handwriting, her mistakes, her compromises. But tonight she did. She turned page by page, slowly. The entries she had forgotten writing, the letters she thought had been discarded, the scanned photos of a boy smiling through silence. Every line read like a confession from a version of herself she no longer recognized. When she reached the photo from the park, the one Robert had once called Ethan, my champion, she finally cried. Not because of what Ethan had said, but because she knew he had always been right. Upstairs, Dylan sent a message. Not to Ethan directly, but to Marcus Hayes. Tell him I meant it. Even if I was late. No reply came. He didn't expect one. The next morning, the Miller house received its first official notice of civil inquiry, a document demanding Robert produce financial records, trust establishment logs, and communication with Cartwright and associated parties. The timeline for submission, 10 business days. Robert stood in the kitchen holding the envelope, his expression unreadable. Susan didn't ask what it said. She already knew. That afternoon, a neighbor passed by and didn't wave. A former friend from Susan's book club left a message saying she was taking a step back until things were sorted. The social consequences were beginning, not cruel, not loud, but precise and cutting. Whispers had begun in their circle, and even the silence outside their home had shifted from respectful to heavy with judgment. Inside, the house breathed like a creature waiting to be put down. Susan spent more time outside now, sitting on the back porch, staring at the trees Ethan once photographed from the attic window. Sometimes she would look up, as if expecting to see him there, camera in hand. But the window remained empty. The air inside grew colder as summer waned. The heating system, for the first time in years, began to fail in certain rooms. The attic, long neglected, grew draftier. No one went up there. It remained as Ethan had left it, half-packed, walls bare, computer gone. Just a single photo taped to the back of the door, Ethan, age 8, holding a broken drone he had rebuilt from scraps. Smiling at the lens like someone who hadn't yet learned what silence cost. And still, no one spoke his name aloud. They didn't need to. The house said it for them. The apartment in Tacoma wasn't large. One bedroom, a small kitchen with laminate countertops, and a window that overlooked a quiet street lined with maple trees. The furniture was second-hand, an old futon, a pine bookshelf, a desk Ethan had assembled himself, but everything in the space was his. For the first time, the air around him didn't feel borrowed. It was the kind of place people might pass without noticing. That suited him just fine. The move happened gradually over 2 weeks. After filing the lawsuit and severing contact with the Miller house, Ethan lived between places, a few nights in the motel, a week with Marcus, then finally here. He chose Tacoma not for distance, but for anonymity. It was far enough from Seattle to start fresh, but close enough that he could manage his legal affairs and attend his university meetings without trouble. His scholarship, once tentative, had become secured after his story, carefully anonymized and condensed, circulated through forums and advocacy groups. A professor in digital media studies had reached out, offering him a partial scholarship for a research assistantship. The topic, digital storytelling and trauma narrative structure. It wasn't a coincidence. Ethan accepted. With the funding and the attention came both support and risk. He kept his face out of the spotlight. He gave no interviews. The site he had built remained live, archived under new encryption, serving now as an educational tool rather than a viral expose. It was viewed by advocacy groups, family law reformers, and a growing number of people who recognized themselves in its pages. But he never attached his full name to it again. Because he no longer carried the name Miller. The legal change had gone through that week. He stood in a courthouse, calm, clear, and answered every question without hesitation. The clerk stamped the papers. The judge signed them. It was done in under 30 minutes. His new ID arrived 3 days later. Ethan Carter. Carter, his mother's family name. Not a name without flaws, not a banner of purity or perfect love, but his. A name not defined by concealment or betrayal. A name not followed by slammed doors and cold dinners. It was simple, strong, and unconnected to Robert's legacy. On the day the new nameplate arrived, Ethan stood in the doorway of his apartment, screwdriver in hand. He removed the generic mailbox label and affixed the new one. Simple block letters, black on brushed silver. Ethan Carter. He stared at it for a moment. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't symbolic. It was a step forward. Inside the apartment, his desk had become a workstation for projects beyond the lawsuit. He was now working on a documentary, not of his own story, but of similar cases. He had partnered quietly with a small non-profit and was developing interview questions, curating narratives, building visual frameworks. His knowledge of photography and digital editing was finally being used to document others, those still searching for a voice. Sometimes, he still dreamt of the attic room. The creaking of old floorboards, the cold seeping through the window frame, the feeling of watching life happen below him. But in the dream now, he was holding the camera, not as a witness, but as the author. The Miller house no longer reached out. No one called. No one wrote. The case had entered a quiet phase. Depositions were underway. Marcus Hayes had been deposed already, and Cartwright, facing unrelated charges of financial misconduct, had been advised to cooperate fully. Robert's legal team had tried to settle once, privately, quietly, but Ethan refused. This was not about settlement. It was about establishment. Of truth. Of voice. Of identity. On a quiet Saturday morning, as rain tapped against the windows of his apartment, Ethan received a package. No sender's name, just a return address from a city he didn't recognize. Inside was a letter. Typed. No signature. You did what I couldn't. You gave the silence a shape. I won't ask for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know, I kept the first photo. The one where he held you. I look at it sometimes and wonder if things could have been different. Maybe in another life. There was no question who had sent it. He didn't cry. He didn't reply. He folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of his desk, beside the documents he no longer needed to read. Later that day, he visited a local print shop and picked up a photo he had submitted for enlargement. It was one of the first he had taken after moving, an image of the street below his window, light filtering through the leaves, quiet and imperfect. He framed it and hung it above the futon. He was building a life. Not built on spite or revenge, but on recovery. One evening, as he sat editing footage from an interview, he received a text from Dylan. Short. No punctuation. Hope you're good. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. He stared at it for a moment, then typed. Maybe. Someday. Then he put the phone down. He returned to his work. The sound of his own breath filled the room, steady and calm. He was no longer a whisper in his own story. He was the author. And this time, no one would write him out.